My name is Giselle Houle, and my title is How Incorporating Indigenous Perspectives Can Benefit Society. So the article I've chosen is Learning with and from Indigenous People, Navigating Transformative Pedagogy and Privilege in Teacher Education by Laura Lee Kearns. Some key terms to go over are cognitive dissonance, the ACDE, Association of Canadian Deans of Education, the Accord on Indigenous Education, and Indigenous/Aboriginal, which is just an umbrella term. So the study was done on a group of 25 non-Indigenous pre-service teachers in a faculty of education. They worked with and from Indigenous groups within the territory on a service learning project that focused on integrating the English language arts curriculum with Indigenous pedagogy. Kearns collaborated with a cultural organization, and the pre-service teachers were required to create Indigenous focused lesson plans for the organization's database, which would be used to support other teachers. Quantitative and qualitative data from the database show that most pre-service teachers were able to challenge stereotypes, deficit thinking, and expanded their awareness. However, a minority experienced some levels of cognitive dissonance as their own privileged worldviews were challenged. So as a social studies teacher, I would like to address that although this is a language arts study, the article addresses a program that was also used for teaching in a culturally sensitive way for physical education. So Indigenous pedagogy can be applicable to any subject. So my critique is that this case study reflects one classroom and one group of students. So it could be more broad. However, creating a curriculum incorporated with Indigenous pedagogy is a newer work, so I admire what has been done. Additionally, there was not much said about what followed with the pre-service teachers who experienced cognitive dissonance. My concern is that there's actually educators out there who feel that Indigenous perspectives should be left out of the classroom. So why won't change occur? What would happen if Canadian students became well educated on Indigenous history and learned about their perspectives within the curriculum? I believe that there is fear that there would be too many allies. Many peers in university have expressed sympathy for Indigenous peoples, acknowledging that they were ill-informed throughout school, and some would even express guilt. So why does the government want to keep Canadians ill-informed, tell half-truths and one-sided stories? What would happen if all Canadians expressed disappointment towards the government's mistreatment of Indigenous peoples and demanded change? If there were too many people demanding change, then the government would have to deliver, and the government does not want to do that. So why does this matter? Today, there are many calls being made that invite a response. There are calls for social justice in higher education, calls for clean drinking water, calls for protection, calls for equality, and calls to decolonize. Kearns was first introduced to a call and response while being an undergrad student attending an elders conference at Trent University. And Kearns states that, I remember being deeply moved by this experience. There was joy and connections being awakened intellectually, emotionally, physically, and spiritually through the teachings received and participating in Indigenous culture. Kearns 2020. So in 2010, the deans at faculties of education in Canada signed the Accord on Indigenous Education. The Accord addresses that Indigenous people have a right to their knowledge systems, which is protected by the Constitution. The ACDE recognizes its responsibility to keep educators informed on Indigenous education. So the solution was to incorporate Indigenous pedagogy into the curriculum to improve Indigenous education. So the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. Section 7 is a call to close the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Section 62 is a call to collaborate with Indigenous peoples to decolonize education and to include Indigenous perspectives and teach about residential schools from K to 12, along with educating teachers on how to integrate Indigenous pedagogy into their classrooms. Section 64 addresses a need to acknowledge and respect Indigenous spirituality, elders, and knowledge keepers. So there is all these calls to action being made, and there's not really any action on the government's part. So how can we incorporate Indigenous pedagogy into the curriculum? Well, in 2007, the Canadian Council on Aboriginal Learning Centre worked with First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people to represent models of their learning in a national context. Common traits include a holistic and lifelong framework. Holism addresses spiritual, emotional, physical, and intellectual development in relation to oneself, family, community, and the environment. Another thing is that geographics matter because Indigenous peoples are all diverse and unique to the place that they reside on. It is not a one size fits all. As educators, we need to let go of being experts and we need to be able to learn alongside Indigenous community members. In this study, some practices used were modified talking circles and reading Indigenous literature. So, some of the counter arguments. The counter arguments expressed by the male in the situation reflect the same arguments that the UCP express. There is a demand for Eurocentric knowledge, and there is not enough room for Indigenous knowledge. The resistance can be used to predict the outcomes of what decolonizing our classrooms may look like. We may face resistance and receive reactions from professionals that we work with, from parents, or even some students, but this should not prevent us from incorporating Indigenous perspectives into our classroom. In response to the situation, Currents had the students fill out exit cards after class, and many students apologized for the male's behavior. One student acknowledged that they did focus on Eurocentric content for 13 classes, but on Indigenous content for only 4. And only 4 students out of the 25 expressed that they did agree with the statement made in class. So what this tells me is that there is more people who are for decolonizing education. Questions. So what if a student misses the one day that you as a teacher discuss residential school? What if a student falls sick and misses a week in social studies class, which goes over Indigenous history? These students miss important content, and it is not enough. My role as an Indigenous educator is to provide for and advocate for a more diverse education, even if this upsets some people. So the positives that I took away from current study. When you look at the statistics of pre-service teachers who thought that this experience benefited them, the results are remarkable. The pre-service teachers were required on a scale of 1 to 10 to rate whether the experience benefited them in any way, 1 meaning it did not, and 10 being that it did. The majority of pre-service teachers felt like an inclusive education benefited them very much. And seeing the significant impact that this study had for non-Indigenous pre-service teachers, I imagine that incorporating Indigenous pedagogy into the regular K-12 curriculum would also have a significant impact on younger students. The quantitative and qualitative documented survey findings show most pre-service teachers experienced transformative pedagogy, felt empowered, and had their awareness of and appreciation for Indigenous people awakened. Some students wanted to commit to a lifelong process of revitalizing their relationship with Indigenous people. Additionally, one student acknowledged that learning with an Indigenous knowledge system provided them with more knowledge than a textbook ever could provide, emphasizing that Eurocentric knowledge is not the only valid knowledge system, which is why students were forced to attend residential school. They were seen as not having an education, but education was embedded in their way of life. Indigenous voices continue to be left out of all discussions, but if people take a second to listen, they may learn something new. So thank you for listening. Hi. That is everything. If you have any questions, let me know.